30 days. An entire month without seeing sunlight, without hearing the voice of another human being. Under tons of rubble, he believed he would be just another name on the missing list. With hope slowly fading, every second it felt like a blow, an imminent death sentence. But in the depths of silence and despair, something inside him refused to give up. He wasn't just fighting the hunger, the thirst, and the cold. He was fighting his own mind. What seemed to be the end, an unexpected spark emerged. Could this be the last chance to survive? Jack Collins was an ordinary man, living in a small town in the English countryside. At 35, his life followed the routine rhythm of someone who had resigned himself to a simple existence. He worked as an electrician on construction sites in the city, and his contact with his family was limited to occasional visits to his parents, who lived on a distant farm. He had distanced himself from his friends over the years, and, although he tried not to admit it, loneliness was constantly with him. On that fateful day, Jack was in an old building, finishing the installation of an electrical system, when the ground beneath his feet shook violently. Without warning, the entire structure collapsed. The force of the impact was so intense that he barely had time to react. The moment he felt the weight of the rubble falling on him, Jack believed it would be his end. A muffled scream escaped his lips, but the dust and concrete quickly silenced any attempt to call for help. When he awoke, he was enveloped in absolute darkness. Pain in his right leg was unbearable. It was trapped under steel beam. Breathing was short and painful due to the dust still floating in the air. His eyes tried to adjust to the dim light, but the world around him was just a mass of compacted rubble. The only thing keeping him conscious was the throbbing pain in his leg and the growing hunger that was beginning to set in. In the first few minutes, Jack tried to call for help, his voice hoarse and broken. But he soon realized that no one would listen to him. He was buried deeply, and the deafening silence around him caused his mind to begin calculating the magnitude of the disaster. He tried to move, but the pain paralyzed him. The initial shock began to wear off, and panic took its place. He felt the weight of reality bearing down on him. He was alone, trapped, and he had no idea how much time had passed since his collapse. Time, in this suffocating environment, seemed to stretch indefinitely. Jack began to lose track of the days and nights. The only company was his own thoughts, and they weren't kind. He constantly relived the last moments before the collapse, trying to find some warning sign he could have noticed that might have saved him. Each memory was a new stab of guilt and regret. According to the hours, or was it days, passed, Jack found himself confronted not only with hunger and thirst, but also with the oppressive presence of his own despair. The mind in extreme conditions can be both an ally and a mortal enemy. At first, he focused on small goals, trying to move his leg, pushing the beam, staying awake. But as his strength faded, he began to question whether he should continue fighting. It was as if I were falling into a mental abyss, where hope seemed a distant idea and death a comforting inevitability. No one will come. Maybe it's better this way, he thought in moments of weakness. However, there was always a small spark that kept him from giving up completely. He knew that, somehow, someone would look for him, maybe his parents, maybe his coworkers. That fragile hope kept him breathing. As the days went by, Jack began to deal with hallucinations. Extreme isolation and hunger began to distort their perception of reality. Sometimes he heard voices, family, friends, people he hadn't seen in years. Other times, he imagined help was about to arrive. He could almost hear the sound of bulldozers and see beams of light breaking through the concrete. But soon these illusions disappeared, leaving him in an even deeper void. His body was weak, his injured leg was infected. The fever consumed him. With every moment, Jack felt like his time was running out. Still, something inside him refused to give in completely to the darkness. One question haunted him. Why him? Why survive the collapse only to be condemned to a slow death under tons of rubble? The answer, if there was one, had not yet emerged. All Jack knew was that as long as there was a shred of life left in his body, he would fight, even if it was a hopeless battle. Even if it was a losing battle. Jack's days under the rubble turned into an endless sequence of pain and feverish dreams. Every movement of his leg increased the suffering, and he knew the wound was far from getting better. The lack of food and water weakened his body even further, and his mind, already fragile, began to detach from reality. He knew his time was running out, but, paradoxically, each day that passed without dying felt like a small victory, or prolonged torture. In one of these moments of delirium, Jack saw his mother before him. She wore the flower apron he remembered from his childhood, and was standing next to his makeshift bed of debris. Her expression was hard but loving, as if she was waiting for him to say something important. "You were never the type to give up, Jack," her image whispered, her voice reverberating in his mind like a forgotten song. He tried to respond, but his words wouldn't come out. Her image vanished into the air like smoke, and Jack returned to the silent, suffocating darkness. In a flash of consciousness, he began to remember his life before that fateful day. Little details came to light, details that he normally would have ignored. The bitter coffee he drank that morning, the friendly smile of the building receptionist, the strange feeling of restlessness that accompanied him during work. Now, trapped in this concrete hell, he couldn't shake these thoughts, which repeated themselves in a torturous cycle, as if his mind was clinging to the past to avoid the present. As time passed, loneliness began to take on an almost physical form. He felt as if the emptiness around him was pressing against his body, trying to crush any remaining traces of life. Pain, which at first was a constant enemy, became a familiar companion, something he got used to living with. Maybe that was what kept him awake, the fact that while he was in pain, he was still alive. There was a moment, in one of the intervals between fever and lucidity, when Jack heard a sound. Something distant, almost imperceptible, but it was real. A noise. He held his breath, his senses heightened in a way he hadn't felt in days. Would it be a rescue? Was someone finally digging toward him? Or was it just another illusion created by your exhausted mind? He screamed, or at least tried to. His voice came out in a hoarse, barely audible whisper. His throat was dry, his lips were cracked, but he persisted, calling for help with all the strength he still had. The sound stopped. Silence, once again, dominated the room, and Jack felt the frustration rising within him like an uncontrollable tide. But that brief moment of hope, however illusory, reignited something inside Jack. He couldn't just wait for death. If no one found him, he would have to find a way to save himself, to get out of that concrete tomb with his own strength. But how? He could barely move his leg. The infection seemed to be spreading, and his body was too weak to make any attempt to escape. And yet, giving up didn't seem like an option. He began to mentally scan his surroundings. I knew there were parts of the rubble that could still be moved, but the risk was great. Any wrong move could result in a larger collapse, burying him even deeper. But he was running out of choices. That night, or what he assumed was night, since time had lost all meaning, Jack had a clear, almost premonitory vision. He saw himself crawling through a tunnel of rubble, his bloody leg leaving a trail on the concrete as he forced every muscle to keep going. At the end of this tunnel, a faint light shone. It was faint, but it was there. When he woke up, still weighed down by the fever, he decided he needed to try, even if it failed, even if it killed him. What did he have to lose? With a monumental effort, Jack began to move the debris around his leg. Every movement was excruciating, and he grunted in pain, feeling the strength slipping from his body with every second. He managed to move small rocks, but the beam holding his leg seemed immovable. He paused, his chest rising and falling rapidly, sweat running down his face. The feeling of helplessness almost overwhelmed him, but he fought it. Jack remembered his mother's voice, that vision he had days before. You were never the type to give up. He couldn't give in. With each passing second, his survival seemed more uncertain, but he would not allow himself to die without a fight. It was all that was left. As he moved the stones around the beam, a thought crossed his mind. What if this is it? What if I never get out of here? He had no answer, but continued fighting. The minutes, or perhaps hours, passed indefinitely as Jack struggled against the rubble. The pain radiating from his leg was unbearable, and his muscles were almost at their limit. However, he continued to try moving small stones, slowly releasing the pressure on his body. The sound of shifting debris echoed through the concrete cavern, but no other souls seemed to be nearby. Reality was beginning to take its toll. Jack knew his body couldn't last much longer without water or food. His mother's face, which had previously appeared in his hallucinations, now became a symbol of remembrance, almost a silent farewell. He wondered if he would die there, buried and forgotten, far from everything and everyone. But there was always something inside him that kept him going. Maybe it was the fear of death, or maybe it was a part of him that still believed he would come out of that nightmare alive. In one of those moments of pure effort, Jack felt something different. A weak, almost imperceptible wind passed through the space where he was trapped. For a second, he thought his mind was playing yet another cruel trick, but the cool air was real. His heart sped up. If there was a draft, then there might be an opening somewhere nearby. He would need to move, find that way out, even if it meant risking his life even more. Gathering the last remaining strength, Jack began to follow the direction of the breeze. He crawled slowly, groaning in pain with every inch he advanced. His leg throbbed, and he felt his entire body shaking, exhausted. The blood pouring from the wound was a cruel reminder that he didn't have long before he succumbed to fluid loss and infection. But with blind focus he continued. The wind was their only hope. After what seemed like an eternity, Jack spotted a small opening in the wreckage. It was tiny, but it looked promising. He tried to force his way through, but the space was too tight. He felt a wave of frustration hit him like an avalanche. The exit was so close, yet out of reach. There was no way he could widen that passage without more physical strength, and the only way he could continue was to free himself from the beam that still held his leg trapped. Jack knew that meant he would have to sacrifice something. The idea of freeing himself from that beam was accompanied by a terrible reality. He would have to amputate his own leg. The thought filled him with absolute terror. It was something he had seen in movies or read in survivor stories, but he never thought this would be his reality. The mere thought of cutting off his leg made him tremble with fear, but he knew that if he didn't, he would certainly die there, with no chance of escaping. For several minutes, Jack considered the decision. He was already too weak to fight anymore. The infection was spreading, and the fever left him on the brink of unconsciousness. There was no more time. He had to choose: die slowly and painfully under the rubble, or risk everything to try to save his life. With desperate courage, Jack looked around for something he could use as a tool. There weren't many options, but he found a sharp piece of metal buried among the rocks. The shock hit him hard as he realized what he was about to do, but his survival instinct took over. It was that or death. He held the piece of metal, his hands shaking, and began to breathe deeply, trying to mentally prepare himself for what came next. The first attempts were a failure. The pain was too intense, and he screamed in agony, the sound reverberating through the rubble like a ghostly echo. He stopped for a few minutes, his entire body shaking with pain and fear. But again, the image of his mother came into his mind, her voice soft and determined. "You never give up, Jack." He couldn't give up now, not after all. Summoning what was left of his courage, he drove the piece of metal into his leg, cutting through the flesh and ignoring the indescribable pain. The blood was flowing quickly, and he knew he couldn't lose consciousness. With each cut, the pain intensified, and Jack felt as if he were on the verge of madness. But at the same time, the feeling of finally being free from that physical nightmare pushed him to continue. After what felt like an eternity, he finally succeeded. The beam that held his leg was no longer an obstacle. He had managed to free himself, but at what cost? Jack looked at what was left of his leg, barely believing what he had done. But he was free. With the piece of metal still firmly in his hand, Jack began to crawl towards the small opening. With every movement, I felt the pain throughout my body, but now it felt different. It was no longer the pain of prison. It was the pain of liberation. When he finally managed to get through the hole, he felt the cool air on his face again. It was faint, but it was there, and that meant one thing. He was closer to the exit than he had ever been before. Crossing that small opening took every ounce of energy Jack had left. He felt his body on fire, his amputated leg throbbing, and his blood was still slowly oozing out. Every inch advanced was a painful victory, but he was determined not to stop. Now that he had managed to escape the beam that imprisoned him, his only objective was to find a way out. The space in front of him was a tangle of rubble, piled concrete blocks, and twisted pieces of metal. He dragged himself with agonizing slowness, using his arms to pull his weakened body while groaning in pain. In his mind, despair was a constant whirlwind. What if the exit was too far away? What if he couldn't survive long enough to reach her? But what tormented him most were the visions and delusions that continued to haunt him. The image of his mother came and went, floating in his fevered mind, now mixed with other figures from his past. He heard the sound of distant laughter, friends from his childhood, people he had left behind. The illusion of being surrounded by these memories, by happy and familiar moments, made reality even more cruel. Each time he returned to consciousness, he was faced again with the devastating scenario that surrounded him. The delusions began to intensify. In one of these moments, Jack believed he heard his father's voice. It wasn't a memory or a soft whisper like the ones he'd heard before, but a loud, urgent call. "Jack, son, I'm here." His heart quickened, and for a moment, he believed that his father was indeed there, among the rubble, looking for him. "Father," he tried to scream, but his voice was weak and wavering. The effort of screaming made his throat burn, and coughing took him, every spasm of his body reminding him of the fragility of his condition. But when the coughing stopped and silence returned, Jack realized that his father's voice was more of a creation of his mind. Nobody was there. Loneliness, once again, enveloped him like a heavy shadow. He felt a hot tear slide down his dirty, dusty face. It wasn't just the physical pain that destroyed him, but the pain of being completely abandoned, forgotten in the midst of that chaos. However, the strength that came from the depths of his being drove him to continue. He didn't want to die there, alone and without being found. He thought about his parents, about the people who perhaps, somewhere, were still waiting for him to be rescued. And even though his chances were slim, he clung to the thin line of hope that still remained. The light coming through the gap in the rubble was faint, but Jack knew that meant fresh air and, with luck, a path to the surface. Each new move seemed to push his limits even further, but at the same time, brought him closer to his goal. He vaguely remembered stories of survivors, people who went through extreme situations and clung to life against all odds. Jack wanted to be one of those stories. He wanted his fight not to be in vain. After what seemed like an eternity, he managed to crawl through an area where the debris was less compacted. The air there was more breathable, and for a brief moment, he believed he had found a path to freedom. The natural light, however dim, gave him the impression that the sky was above his head. But there was still no way of knowing if this was the end of the concrete maze that imprisoned him. Jack knew his body was at its limit. Blood loss, infection, and exhaustion were piling up. Every breath was an effort, and the simple act of continuing felt like a battle against his own body. It was then that he heard something that made him stop. A distant but distinct sound. The noise of machines. Excavators? He wasn't sure, but the sound seemed real to him. Maybe the rescue team was nearby. Maybe they were digging toward him. A new wave of adrenaline coursed through his body, and he tried to scream, but the sound that came out was low, almost inaudible. With his heart racing, Jack began tapping on the rubble around him, trying to create some kind of signal. Each beat resonated in his mind like a cry for help. But the truth was that his strength was quickly running out. He knew he needed to stay calm and save what little energy he had left. But the fear of being ignored, of not being heard, was overwhelming. The sound of the machines stopped for a moment, and silence reigned again. Jack felt his heart sink in his chest, despair taking over him again. What if it was just another figment of your imagination? What if he was delusional, with no rescue in sight? The fine line between hope and despair was cruel. Every second that passed without an answer made doubt grow in his mind. But then a new sound emerged. This time, clearer, closer. Human voices. He wasn't imagining it. Jack held his breath, trying to hear better. They were real voices, people were there. They weren't arriving. With the last strength he had left, he hit the rubble again, trying to make some noise that would attract attention. His body shook with weakness, but he knew this could be his last effort. If they passed by and didn't find him, it would be the end. Little by little, the voices became louder. He could hear footsteps, the sound of rocks being moved. Tears of relief began to stream down his face as he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. "Here, please." "I'm here." The answer came slowly and uncertainly. Jack heard a scream, someone calling for him. The voices were now closer, clearer. He tried to respond, but his voice was too weak to echo through the rubble. Hope, which had appeared like a small flame, wavered dangerously between certainty and doubt. He was so close to salvation, but his body was no longer responding. Then the sound of rocks being moved intensified, and Jack heard what sounded like a coordinated team discussing how to access the area. The noises of tools and machinery penetrated his ears like a melody of salvation. His hands shook, eyes closing and opening as he fought to stay conscious. He couldn't pass out now, not when he was so close to being rescued. "Here?" a male voice shouted. "I think we have someone here." Jack's heart quickened at those words. He wanted to respond, wanted to scream, but all he could do was hit the stone in front of him weakly. The sound was low, almost imperceptible, but enough to attract the attention of the rescue team. "Are you listening to me?" the voice asked again, now much closer. "Yes," Jack murmured, his words slurred and distant. He didn't know if the rescuer had heard, but he kept trying, determined not to give up. "I am here." With desperate energy, he tried to move one of his arms, dragging himself as little as possible towards the source of the voices. The pain was intense, but the desire to get out of that hell overcame any other sensation. He needed to be found. More voices echoed through the rubble, and he heard the metallic sound of tools being used to break through. Jack knew the rescue team was approaching. Flashlight lights finally pierced the darkness around him, a faint but real beam illuminating his concrete prison. The light hit his face, and he could barely lift his head, but he did his best to indicate that he was alive. "I found him. He's here," one of the voices shouted, and Jack let a wave of relief wash over him. "I was saved. Finally." The next few moments were a blur of activity. Strong hands began to move the rocks around Jack, freeing up more space so he could be pulled out. He felt his arms being lifted, and his body, now exhausted beyond comprehension, was gently moved. The pain from his amputated leg hit him in waves, but everything seemed distant, as if his brain was shielding itself from the intensity of the pain. When he was finally pulled from the rubble, sunlight hit his face, and he blinked against the bright glare. Fresh air filled his lungs, and for the first time in so many days, he felt like he was actually breathing. His eyes filled with tears, not just of pain, but of relief, of gratitude for still being alive. He had succeeded. Jack was placed on a stretcher and quickly surrounded by paramedics. They spoke to each other in urgent tones, checking his vitals, adjusting the gurney so he was stable. He could barely process the surrounding words, but he felt a strange calmness invade his body. Rescue had arrived. The nightmare, at least the physical part, was ending. As paramedics worked quickly to stabilize him, Jack began to drift into a state of semi-unconsciousness. The lights and sounds around him became blurs, and he just let the relief wash over him. His fight to survive, no matter how intense and painful it was, had been won. In the hours that followed, Jack was transported to a local hospital, where he received the necessary care for his seriously injured leg. The medical team moved quickly, and he was soon taken to the operating room. The amputation of his leg below the knee was inevitable, but Jack was at peace with that. He knew it had saved his life. When he woke up in the hospital days later, Jack was surrounded by machines that monitored his vital signs. The environment was silent, with the light hum of equipment in the background. He opened his eyes slowly, still confused, trying to process everything that had happened. The body felt heavy, and the pain, although under control, was still a constant presence. His amputated leg was covered in bandages, and he knew his life would never be the same. But there was something extraordinary about that feeling of being alive. He breathed deeply, feeling the air in his lungs, and the first thing that came to mind was a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. Jack had survived the impossible. For 30 days he had fought against death, against pain, against his own mind. In the days that followed, Jack had time to reflect on everything. The doctors explained that his recovery would be long, that he would have to deal with the physical and psychological effects of everything he had experienced. Yet he knew that he had somehow come out stronger. Not physically, as his body was weakened, but mentally. Jack had discovered a resilience within himself that he never imagined he possessed. The world outside had continued while he was trapped under the rubble. But for Jack, everything had changed. He wondered if he would be able to return to normal life, if that nightmare would be behind him, or if it would haunt him forever. In the silence of the hospital, Jack stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. The distant sound of machines marked the constant rhythm of his survival, but inside him, an emotional storm was brewing. The joy of being alive was mixed with the stinging pain of loss, not just of his leg, but of a part of himself that had been buried in the rubble. He felt like he would never be the same again. Visits to the hospital began slowly. Friends and family arrived, exchanging words of comfort, but there was an implicit silence that no one dared to mention. What would Jack's life be like from now on? Every empathetic smile he received was like a knife stabbed deeper into his soul. They didn't know, they couldn't imagine what it was like to be on the brink of death for so long. And even when they rescued him, he knew he wasn't completely out of that nightmare. One afternoon, his mother entered the hospital room. Her eyes were red, tired from crying. She slowly approached the bed, not knowing what to say. Jack looked at her, and there, in that silent meeting of eyes, all the accumulated pain of the last 30 days manifested itself. He started to cry. They were not ordinary tears. They were the tears of someone who had touched the abyss and returned. From those who, at some point, thought they would no longer see the sunlight. His mother, without saying anything, held his hand, and they cried together. Jack felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. The physical pain, the hallucinations, the fears that consumed him during the days he was imprisoned. His mother's hug was the anchor that kept him from drowning in his own anguish. But it also reminded him that, even surrounded by love, he was irreversibly changed. There was something on his mind that he still couldn't express. A part of Jack wanted to be grateful for being alive, but another part felt a sharp pain, as if he was mourning his old life. He knew he would have to rebuild himself, but how could he do that when everything around him seemed to be falling apart? How to accept loss and move on when your mind was still trapped under the rubble? Days passed, and Jack, now released from the hospital, was back at his parents' house. The place that had once been his childhood refuge now felt like an emotional prison. Each room carried memories that, instead of comfort, brought an unbearable weight. He felt like a stranger in his own life, as if he had returned from a journey from which he would never return in one piece. One night, sitting on his bed, Jack picked up a small mirror that his mother had left next to the table. He hesitated for a moment before looking at himself. The reflected face looked like that of a man much older than his 35 years. The marks of trauma, the paleness of someone who had gone through a silent struggle, were all there, printed. But what hit him the most was the emptiness in his own eyes. There was something broken inside him, something he didn't know if he could ever repair. The routine of relearning how to live was exhausting. Daily physical therapy required monumental effort, and every false step with the prosthetic made him miss the leg he had lost. But it wasn't just the body that needed to be rehabilitated. Jack found himself confronted by invisible ghosts, the memories of the rubble, the sound of his own breathing struggling for life, the hallucinations. At many moments, he wondered if he had truly been rescued, or if he was still trapped, somehow, in the wreckage of his mind. One morning, his mother came into the room without saying a word, as if she knew something was wrong. Jack was sitting by the window, looking at the horizon, but with empty eyes. She approached him and, with a delicacy that only a mother can have, placed her hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Jack," she said quietly, but he knew she wasn't. The weight of what he had experienced was too much to put into words. He turned to her, tears in his eyes. "I should be dead," he whispered. The emptiness that consumed him was greater than any physical pain he had felt. But at that moment, in his mother's touch, he realized something subtle. Perhaps, little by little, there was a way back, even if distant. Time passed, but Jack's healing process seemed to stagnate. Physically, he advanced in physiotherapy sessions, forcing his body to adapt to the prosthesis. But his mind was stuck, unable to follow the rhythm. The nights were long and lonely, filled with nightmares, in which he relived the collapse. Darkness enveloped him again, and he felt the weight of the rubble, the oppression of the deadly silence. "I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart was racing, and the feeling of suffocation persisted. One afternoon, as Jack was trying to walk through the garden, something unexpected happened. Her little niece, Emily, came running up. She was just 6 years old, full of energy, innocent of what he had been through. Not understanding the gravity of the situation, she looked at Jack curiously and pulled his hand away. "Uncle Jack, come play with me," she said with that childish smile that cut something deep in him. For a second, Jack was frozen. The idea of playing, of being part of something so simple, seemed impossible. He had moved so far away from normality that he didn't know if he was capable of feeling the lightness of a child again. But something about Emily's purity disarmed him. He let her guide him to the swing in the garden. As he sat down, Jack watched as Emily laughed and ran around him, unaware of the scars he bore. He tried, for the first time in months, to smile. It was a shy, hesitant, but genuine smile. Something about that child made him feel alive in a different way. Maybe there was something still intact inside Jack, something that suffering couldn't completely destroy. Emily stopped running and approached again, her eyes shining with innocence. "Uncle Jack, are you going to be okay?" The simple question echoed in his heart. Jack, his voice breaking, looked at her and, for the first time, felt like the answer might be yes. Emily's presence was an unexpected balm for Jack. In the days that followed, she visited him frequently, always full of energy and innocent questions. Something about the simplicity with which she saw the world calmed him, helped him distract, even if briefly, from the painful memories that haunted him. One afternoon, while Jack was sitting on the porch, Emily approached him with a sheet of paper. She had drawn them both, her running and Jack at her side, with a mechanical leg. In the drawing, he looked happy, and that simple detail moved him in an unexpected way. "I drew you and me, Uncle Jack. Look, your new leg is magical," Emily said proudly. Jack looked at the drawing for long seconds. The idea of seeing yourself as something beyond your physical limitations seemed impossible until that moment. But in her view, he wasn't a broken man stuck in the past. He was someone complete, strong, capable of living and adapting. His eyes filled with tears, and he hugged the girl, feeling a wave of emotion come over him. How could someone so small see something that he himself couldn't? "Thank you, Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking, holding back tears. At that moment, Jack realized that perhaps he was beginning to accept it. The emotional wounds were still there, open and painful. But there was something new growing inside him, a seed of hope, planted by the purity of a child who saw him beyond his scars. When Emily left that night, Jack looked at the drawing for a long time. It was a portrait of something he didn't yet feel, but that somehow he began to believe he could achieve. He kept the drawing carefully, knowing that that small piece of paper represented much more than a child's game. The weeks passed, and Jack began to reconnect with the world around him, albeit with timid steps. Little moments with Emily, brief conversations with her parents, and even quiet days on the porch brought a new perspective. Life, which before seemed so distant and unattainable, began to make sense again, even if in a fragile way. One morning, Jack decided it was time to face what he feared most, returning to the site of the collapse. The idea had haunted him since the day he left the hospital, but he knew he needed to close that chapter in his life. He needed to confront the place that almost took everything from him. When he arrived at the site of the ruins, he felt his heart tighten in his chest. The building was in pieces, surrounded by security strips, as demolition machines continued their work. The smell of dust and metal was still in the air, and Jack felt a wave of nausea at the sight of the rubble that had once been his prison. He stood there, standing still, staring at the place where he had been buried for 30 long days. For a moment his body froze. The memories came in a whirlwind. The muffled sound of the fall, the suffocating despair, the feeling of being crushed by the darkness. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, trying to shake off the wave of panic that threatened to overwhelm him. But this time, something was different. He was no longer trapped in that place. He was standing, alive despite everything. As Jack looked at the rubble, a silent tear ran down his face. It wasn't sadness, but relief. He had survived, and at that moment he understood that his life would not be defined by what happened there. The suffering, the pain, the physical and emotional scars, all of this was part of him, but it didn't limit him. Jack felt, for the first time, that there was something beyond survival. There was life. With one last look at the place, he turned his back and walked away, ready to start over.
If this story captured and moved you, don't forget to like the video, share with those who love intense stories like this, and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more narratives that will surprise you and stir your emotions. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey.